Alright, what is up everyone? Welcome back to the stream. Today is day 19 of becoming a full stack developer in 8 months. And today probably is going to be a shorter one because I don't have much time, but we're beginning with Grid, CSS Grid. I've got a new lighting. If you can notice, wait a second. So this is my new lighting right now. This was my old one, so I think there is a huge improvement, and I'm keeping both on, so there is more light hitting my face at all times. The background is kind of messy, but after all I'm streaming in my living room, so get over it. Anyways, we're starting with CSS Grid, and this is something I never got to understand while I was learning web dev back in the day. So I stuck with Flexbox, and Flexbox was the one that spoke to me better. I was able to understand it, and it was more used around the corner, I believe. So today we're tackling CSS Grid, and let's see how much I understand this time, because last time it was a disaster. Alright, so let's begin with it. Introduction to CSS Grid. Alright. Over the next few lessons we'll cover CSS Grid and make page layouts much easier. Alright. First we'll take a look back at Flexbox and then learn about Grid. The following lessons will show you how to create a grid, position grid items, and use some advanced properties. Then we'll take a deeper look between Flexbox and Grid. Ultimately, we'll be working towards building a dashboard project using Grid. So this is the final project of the intermediate HTML and CSS, which I'm really looking forward to. It was an admin dashboard, and after we're done with that we can continue on with the JavaScript, which is more exciting. So lesson overview. This section contains a general overview of topics that you will learn in this lesson. Compare the basics between Flexbox and Grid, and describe a situation for using Grid over Flexbox. A look back at Flex. In the foundations course you learned a lot about Flexbox. If you've been using Flex here and there along the way, this section will be a quick refresher before we get into Grid. If you're completely lost on Flex, then it might be helpful to go back through the Flex lessons again and get up to speed. So we're not doing that. I'm pretty familiar with Flexbox. The Flex lessons covered positioning items along the two Flex axes, main and cross, and how to get their Flex alignment, how to set their Flex alignment. You also learned how to make your Flex items grow, shrink, change their size. This is the real beauty of Flexbox, as items can flex to stretch out or shrink down. You will remember you can line up a nice row of Flex items like this. So it is just display Flex, and then the container divs have a flex of 1. If we remove this, will anything change? I don't think so. No. Alright, so it will indeed. Flex 1 means they should take as much space as possible, and since it's 3 of them, they're equally taking as much space as possible. Or a column like this, they just do Flex direction column, and I think this is to both shrink and grow, or yeah, I'm not sure about this. But anyways, for one-dimensional layouts, Flex offers a convenient tool without having to rely on floats or CSS hacks to align your items properly. For two-dimensional layouts, you learned a little bit about Flex Wrap, which allows you to take your Flex items and wrap them to the next line. This can be done with either a row that wraps to another row, or a column that wraps to another column. So it doesn't matter if how do I say it? Anyways, this sentence, I understand it, but it's a little bit hard to explain. This can be done with either a row that wraps to another row. So this one, another item will wrap onto the next row, or a column, so that wraps onto another column. So if you have a flex direction of column, if there would be another item here, but there is no space, it will wrap to the next column. Right. Remember how much fun you had solving the card layout in this exercise? Well, I don't remember this exercise, to be quite honest. But probably because I know Flexbox, I've skipped it. But I don't know. I don't remember, honestly. Right. So we know that was a frustrating one, but it's part of the point. While Flexbox allows you to build a layout of rows and columns together, it isn't always easy, but setting up a two-dimensional layout of cards would be much easier using CSS Grid. So let's see what they're doing here. They have a grid container of display grid template columns. So the columns are 75 pixels by 75 by 75, 3 times 75. And grid template rows 2 times 75. So we have 3 columns and 2 rows, and the gap is 32 pixels between them. And about the card, they just set the background color and the border so we can see it. Sure. So let's see, what is Grid? Although Grid is a newer module to CSS, this layout tool has long been in development. Fun fact, CSS co-creator Dr. Bert Boss, no relation to Wes Boss, started working on this layout model in 1996. The idea was inspired by the use of grid-like layouts in other forms of media like newspapers and magazines. After years of thorough demonstrations and development, CSS Grid was finally introduced to all major browsers in 2017. As shown above, Grid is often praised for easy placement of items in a two-dimensional layout, but Grid can be used for one-dimensional layouts too. One advantage for developers is if they start off with only one row of items, they can add additional rows later. You'll notice a lot of similarities between Flex and Grid. Both use parent containers with child items. They have similar property names for alignment and positioning, but you also come across a lot of differences between the two and opinions on how each module should be used. For example, if you've been struggling to get your Flex items all to match evenly in size, Grid can make this type of layout much easier. When reviewing older resources, keep in mind that the differences between Flex and Grid can also change as these modules get updated. One of the big highlights for CSS Grid was the use of gap property, which we'll cover in the next lesson. This used to only be available to Grid, but is now supported with Flexbox too. While some people thought CSS Grid was here to replace Flexbox, so I remember when that was the thing. You will learn by the end of these lessons that Grid is just another tool for the back. In fact, not only do each of these modules have their own use cases, but you also find it helpful to pair Flex and Grid together. But we'll be covering all of that in the concluding lesson. First, you'll learn how to actually make a grid. So, knowledge check. How can you use Flex to make a two-dimensional layout with Flex wrap? While CSS Grid introduced to make structures like in magazines and newspapers, and Which CSS layout module would you use to easily make equal sized items in a container? So because they're equally sized, it will be Grid. Let's watch through the additional resources, read through CSS tricks, and check out the story of CSS Grid. Alright, so this looks interesting. I guess it's a longer one, but we'll read through it. But first we have a video to watch, and I'll get my headphones so we can watch this together. Alright, so let's see what that is. Oops, no.
Grid. One of the biggest questions people ask when they first learn about CSS Grid is, hey, does this replace Flexbox? Should I use Grid instead of Flexbox? No, that's not really how things are going to work. So Grid has been invented to do things that Flexbox couldn't do, and Flexbox is still a great tool for us to use to do things that Grid can't do. And we're also going to use a lot of the other parts of CSS that we've used for layout for a long time. Floats, for example, there'll be plenty of times to use a float. And
there is no time to use a float.
The way the web pages get laid out, the way it's always been before CSS actually was invented, the way content flows down the page in a block direction or an inline direction, these are all parts of a larger picture that we'll want to understand and put Grid into that situation. We'll use Grid on certain parts of the page and not on other parts of the page. It's not like the tools that we've been using, say, Bootstrap or Foundation or 960 Grid back in the day. It doesn't handle layout for the whole page. It handles layout for a particular container, one container on the page, and the items that are directly a direct child of that container. So you're going to mix Grid with other things. You'll mix Grid with Flexbox. You'll mix Grid with a basic flow. You'll mix Grid with floats, with other kinds of things. So why do you want to use Flexbox? Why do you want to use CSS Grid? Which one should you use when? Flexbox is really great when you want to line things up in one direction. Maybe you could think of it as a whole bunch of boxes that are in an infinitely long line. Oh, but it's not infinitely long. It's actually a limited amount of space, so it happens to wrap or it doesn't wrap. Whether it wraps or not, the calculations that are being made are all happening one line at a time. The browser only ever thinks about things in one dimension at a time. It doesn't have any way to know if you end up with several different rows. It doesn't calculate information across those rows, or if you're going in the other direction. It will calculate them in one direction and not in the other direction. Grid has the ability to line things up in two directions, and in fact Grid always wants to line things up in two directions. You can't get it to kind of stagger things. It thinks about rows and columns at the same time, and it's going to want to make adjustments to your grid based on what's going on in both of those directions at the same time. So here's a diagram of a layout that you would do with Grid, where things are actually lining up in both directions. And here's a diagram of how things might work out in Flexbox, where the calculations are being done in each row one at a time with no regard to the other rows. And you can see that those things don't actually line up. Perhaps it's dependent on the size of the content or the size of the amount of stuff that's on the page. Here's a diagram that really kind of shows you what Grid is good at and what Flexbox is good at.
That makes sense.
There are some situations where Flexbox or Grid could be used where they basically do the same thing. One thing, though, that Grid can do that Flexbox cannot do is intentionally overlap items. So if you're in a situation where maybe either one would work, but you want to overlap items, then that's going to be a situation you definitely want to use Grid in. Here's an example where we've got
So wait, if you want to overlap items, you want to use Grid? Did she say that?
One thing, though, that Grid can do that Flexbox cannot do is intentionally overlap items. So if you're in a situation where maybe either one would work, but you want to overlap items, then that's going to be a situation you definitely want to use Grid in. Here's an example where we've got images, content images.
This is overlapping the image, is that what it is?
Images, not background images, but images in the content, and I've got a sentence for each one and a little background color on each of those sentences. The sentences are different lengths, so we don't want to use some sort of absolute positioning or something that's not going to work for different amounts of content. We're going to use Grid for this, but we're using Grid. We could use Flexbox if there was no...
It seems a little bit overkill to use Grid for that. I don't know.
No overlap, but because there's overlap, we want to use Grid in this situation.
Because you could just put everything in that in a div, let's say, with the image, with the text, and the background could be just a background property of the text, and just use either Flexbox or... Anyways, I don't know how would you use Grid. I'm sorry if you hear the drilling, it's fucking annoying, I know.
So get to know Grid,
But
get
anyways,
to know Flexbox, kind of know what each one is.
that
best
video
at,
was so and so. I believe they could have picked
depends
a
on which one has the
better view
superpowers
that's
that you need at that.
already uploaded quite a long ago. But yeah, do you hear the drill and how annoying it is from 1 to 10? I think it's kinda late for that. But anyways, these fucking guys. Alright, so let me zoom in a little bit so you can read as well. And we are looking at quick, what's the difference between... I'm going to keep my headphones on because I keep hearing this fucking drill. So, what's the difference between Flexbox and Grid? Let's go rapid fire and try to answer this question with quick points rather than wonky explanations. There are a lot of similarities between Flexbox and Grid, starting with the fact that they are used for layout and much more powerful than any layout technique that came before them. They can stretch and shrink, they can center things. They can center things, they can reorder things, they can align things. There are plenty of layout situations in which you could use either one to do what we need to do, and plenty of situations where one is more well suited than the other one. Let's focus on the differences rather than the similarities. So Flexbox can optionally wrap. If we allow a Flex container to wrap, they will wrap down onto another row. When the Flex items fill a row, they will line up on the next row. Where they line up on the next row is independent of what happened on the first row, allowing for a mastery-like look. Grid can also optionally wrap if we allow outfilling, in the sense that items can fill a row and move on to the next row or auto place themselves, but as they do, they'll fall along the same grid lines all the other elements do. Alright, but then what's up with this one? I can see it's alright. Okay. Maybe I understand it, I kinda don't, so I'm going to withdraw my questions for now. You could think of Flexbox as one-dimensional, while Flexbox can make rows and columns in the sense that it allows elements to wrap. There is no way to decoratively control where elements end up, since the elements merely push along a single axis and then wrap or not wrap accordingly. They do as they do, if you will, along a one-dimensional plane, and it's because of that single dimension that we can optionally do things like align elements along a baseline, which is something Grid is unable to do. You could so row wrap, yep. You could think of Grid as two-dimensional. In fact, we can, if you want, to declare the sizing of rows and columns and then explicitly place things into both rows and columns as we choose. So they make a grid with 3 columns, and the third one will be 3 times the big as the first and last one. They make 3 rows also, where first row will be 200 pixels and the second one will be auto, which I'm not sure how this is going to look like, and the last one will be 100 pixels. So we have header, dot main sidebar, grid template areas. I don't quite get it anyways. Now we can explicitly place items in the defined rows and columns. So child grid area, child 1. Yeah, I'm not sure. They don't give us the HTML, so it's kind of hard to imagine how these children are placed, for example. If it's just one grid with all of these children, Flexbox on top, grid on bottom. Alright. I'm not the world's biggest fan of the 1D versus 2D differentiation of grid versus Flexbox, only because I find most of my day-to-day usage of grid is 1D, and it's great for that. I wouldn't want someone to think they have to use Flexbox and not grid, because grid is only when you need 2 dimensions. It's a strong distinction to that 2D layout is possible with grid through in ways it is not in Flexbox, which I'm unsure. I think everything is possible with Flexbox because I've only been using Flexbox for a while and never had issues. There were cases when it would have been easier to use grid, and for those maybe I found out a way how to do it in grid, but I think you can make everything in Flexbox, but correct me if I'm wrong. Grid is mostly defined on the parent element. In Flexbox, most of the layout beyond the very basics happen on the children. So I mean, this even as CSS. This is good that they paste the code in, but I like concept, and this is just, I don't know, I don't like this style of just pasting code and not really explaining what everything is doing and not giving context in terms of HTML and the end result. So they say grid is better at overlapping. Getting elements to overlap in Flexbox requires looking at traditional stuff like negative margins, transforms, or absolute positioning in order to break out of the flex behavior. With grid we can place items on overlapping grid lines or even right within the same exact grid cells. Grid is sturdier. While the flexing of Flexbox is sometimes its strength, the way a flex item is sized gets rather complicated. It's a combination of width, min width, max width, flex basis, flex grow, and flex shrink, not to mention the content inside and things like white space, as well as other items in the same row. Grid has interesting space occupying features like factorial units, so 1 FR for example, or 3 FR, and the ability for content to break grids. Through generally speaking, we're setting up grid lines and placing items within them that pop right into place. Flexbox can push things away. It's a rather unique feature of Flexbox that you can, for example, put margin right auto on an element, and if there is room, that element will push everything else as far as it can go. So I never knew that. I think it will be an interesting trick, but I'm probably going to forget it in a minute. Here are some of my favorite tweets on the subject. So we'll read through these tweets. We're not reading through the comments, but let's check out the tweets. Flexbox looks like it does what you want, but grid is usually what you want. Alright, I like this one. For y'all that have an understand of both CSS Grid and Flexbox, what's your favorite way of explaining the difference? Jane Simmons, is that the lady we just watched? She kind of looks like her. I think she's the one from the video we just watched. Alright. Grid makes actual columns and rows. Content will line up from one to the other as you ask it to. Flexbox doesn't. Not only in the second dimension, which is easiest to talk about, but also in the first dimension. Flexbox isn't for most of the things we've been using it for. So we have more replies, but I need to go through Twitter and I don't have an account I'm actively using. How about this? Flexbox is for alignment, Grid is for layout. I like this one as well. This is almost always how I wind up using them. It allows them to preserve their relationships to one another. It also allows each to be used for its strength, even though each can do the other thing. So Flexbox for alignment and Grid for layout. There is he's replying to the first guy. There is a more subtle difference in whether you want to specify down from the parent or up from the children. I often explain Flexbox as being best when you have a bunch of stuff of different sizes and just want a reasonable in proportion layout from them. If you start constraining all your flex items with the width, then more often that will not be easier to use. Then more often than not it will be easier to use Grid. Alright. Here's another difference, but it's not a favorite way of describing them. Just feels the knowledge. Flexbox takes 2 passes to finish, Grid takes 3. Someone could say Grid is slow and Flexbox is fast. So why does it take 2 passes to finish? Is it because you have display flex and then flex direction column, and for a grid you have to set the grid and then the columns and rows? I'm not sure. For me, Grid is there to create full layout grids with more control over how the whole are. Oh my god, I'm not fucking reading this. She pisses me off how she wrote this. The distinction between the two is often blurry, especially now that we have gap for Flexbox. Grid is best suited for a few specific cases, 2D obviously, but also things like overlapping elements, while Flexbox usually shines in simpler yet common layout requirements. Alright, so we're done with that article. I'm kind of glad. And we have a lot to read here on the history of CSS Grid. Alright, so the story of CSS Grid from its creators. Cool. A list part. On October 17th, Microsoft Edge browser shipped its implementation of CSS Grid. This is a milestone for a number of reasons. First, on October 17th, but what year is that? Well, the article was written in 2017, so I guess it's 2017. Okay. First, it means that all major browsers now support this incredible layout tool. Second, it means that all major browsers roll out their implementations in a single year. A terrific example of standard success and cross-browser collaboration. But third, and perhaps more interestingly, it closes the loop on a process that has been more than 20 years in the making. Not a new idea. While the modern concept of a grid layout has been with us since the Industrial Revolution, grids have been a design tool for centuries. As such, it shouldn't come as a shock that grid-based layouts have been a goal of CSS since the beginning. According to Dr. Beth Boss, who co-created CSS with Hakan Wyum Lee, grid-based layouts have actually been on his mind for quite some time. CSS started as something very simple. Boss recalled, it was just a way to create a view of a document on a very simple small screen at the time. 20 years ago, screens were very small, so when we saw that we could make a style sheet for documents, we thought, well, what else can we do now that we have a system for making style sheets? Looking at what books and magazines were doing with layouts was a great inspiration for them. Independent of the content on every page, it has a certain layout, Boss said. Page numbers are in certain places and images are always aligned to the certain slides, left or right or in the middle. We wanted to capture that. Early on, browser makers wrote of the idea as too complex to implement, but grid layout concepts kept cropping up. In 1996, Boss, Lee and Dave Subman, Supreme Overload, thank you for joining the stream yet again, my brother. I'm doing good, man, just reading about CSS Grid, and after we're done with that, we're going to make a project using it, and we're done with the intermediate HTML and CSS, which I'm very thankful about. And after that, we're continuing with JavaScript. I'm excited. But yeah, we have just a little bit more to go. Alright, so where are we? Came up with a frame-based layout model. Then in 2005, Boss released the advanced layout module, which later turned into the template layout module. Despite enthusiasm for these concepts from the web design community, none of them ever shipped in a browser. Hence why I haven't heard of them. Once more with feeling, grid concepts being thrown at the wall of the CSS working group with some regularity, folks were hopeful one of them would stick eventually, and the idea that was a proposal from a couple of folks at Microsoft who had been looking for a more robust layout tool for one of their web-based products. Phil Coop had been put in charge of the UI team tasked with reimagining Microsoft Intune, a computer management utility. Coop was a big fan of Silverlight, a browser plugin that supported robust layout tools from Windows Presentation Foundation, and initially had planned to go that route for building the new Intune. As it happened, however, Microsoft was in the planning stages of Windows 8 and were going to enable building apps with web technologies. Upon learning this, Cup wanted to follow suit with Intune, but he quickly realized that the web was in desperate need of better layout options. So he joined a new team so he could focus on bringing some of the rich layout options that existed in Silverlight, like grid layout, to the web. Interestingly, folks on this new team were already noticing the need. At the time, many app developers were focusing on iPhones and iPads, which only require designers to consider two different fixed canvas sizes, 4 if you consider portrait and landscape. Windows had to support a ton of different screen sizes, screen resolutions, and form factors, and resizable windows. In short, Microsoft needed a robust and flexible layout tool for the web desperately, if the web was going to be an option for native app development on Windows. After working extensively with various teams within Microsoft to assemble a draft specification, Cup and his team shipped a grid layout implementation behind the MS vendor prefix in Internet Explorer 10 in 2011. They followed that up with a draft grid layout spec which they presented to the W3C in 2012. Of course, this was not the first or even the third time the W3C had received a grid layout spec to consider. What was different this time, however, was that they also had an actual implementation to evaluate and critique. Also, we as developers finally had something we could noodle around with. Grid layout was no longer just a theoretical possibility. A handful of forward-thinking web designers and development, Rachel Andrew, an invited expert to the W3C, chiefly among them, began to tinker. I came across CSS Grid initially at a workshop that Bert Boss was leading in French, and I don't really speak French, but I was watching the slides and trying to follow along. Andrew recalled I saw him demonstrate the template layout spec. I think he was really talking about it in terms of print and using this stuff to create print layouts, but as soon as I saw that, I was like, no, we want this for the web. This is something that we really need, and its feasibility to properly lay things out. And so I started digging into it and finding out what he was doing and building more examples. Alright, just a second. Then I saw the Microsoft implementation of the draft grid layout spec, which gave me a real implementation that I could build examples to show other people, and I wanted to do that not just because it was interesting and I liked interesting things to play with. It was because I wanted to get it out there and get other people to have a look at it, because I've been doing this for a long time and I know that specs often show up and then no one really talks about them and they kind of disappear again. And I was absolutely determined that grid layout wasn't going to disappear. It was going to be something that other people found out about and got excited about, and hopefully we'd actually get this into browsers and be able to use it. So the spec evolves. The draft spec that Kup presented to the W3C and that his team shipped in Internet Explorer 10 is the grid layout spec we have today. It was a step in the right direction, but it was far from perfect. Wait, it's not the one we have today, sorry. The one Phil Kup submitted was a very track-based system. Recalled Elika Etemat, an invited expert to the W3C and an editor of the CSS Grid layout module. There was only a numeric addressing system when there were no line names, there were no templates, none of that stuff. But it had a layout algorithm that they were confident would work because they had been doing experimental implementations of it. The original grid that Bert Boss came up with was really the reason that I joined the CSS working group, recalled Google's Tab Atkins, another editor of the CSS Grid layout module. At the time I was learning all the terrible layout hacks, and seeing the possibility to just write my page layout in CSS and just have it all kind of work was astonishing. And then seeing the draft from Phil Kup and seeing it all laid out properly and with a good algorithm behind it, I knew it was doing something that could actually exist now. Right. It was also a compelling option because, unlike previous proposals which specified rigid layouts, this proposal was for a responsive grid system. You can be explicit about the size of a grid item, Etement explained, but you can also say be the size that your content takes up, and that was what we needed to move forward. However, the specific draft wasn't approachable as many of the CSS working group wanted it to be, so the group looked to bring in ideas from some of its earlier explorations. What we really liked about Bert's proposal was that it had this very elegant interface to it that made it easy to express layouts in a way that you could intuitively see. It's like an ASCII art format to create a template where you could put it in your code, like the width of the columns and the heights of the rows. You could embed those in some kind of like ASCII diagram, and then made it a lot easier to see what you were doing. Peter Linz, then co-chair of the CSS working group, also suggested that they incorporate the concept of grid lines in the spec instead of only talking about tracks. He believed including these familiar graphic design concepts would make the spec more accessible to designers. When we were thinking initially about CSS Grid, we were thinking about it in a very app-centric model, where we called Microsoft's Rosen Atanasov, who is also an editor of the spec. But Grid is nothing new. I mean, Grid's been here for a very long time, and that traditional type of grid has always been based on lines, and we've been kind of ignoring the lines. When we realized that we could marry the two implementations, the app side and the typography side of Grid, this for me personally was one of the aha moments that really inspired me to continue working on Grid. So the CSS working group began tweaking Microsoft's proposal to incorporate these ideas. The final result allows you to think about grid systems in terms of track or lines or templates, or even all of the three at once. Of course, getting there wasn't easy. Refine and repeat. As you can probably imagine, reconciling three different ideas, Microsoft proposal, Boss advanced layout, and Lin's additional grid lines, wasn't a simple cut and paste. There were a lot of tricky aspects and edge cases that needed to be worked out. I think some of the tricky things at the beginning were taking all the different aspects of the three proposals that we're trying to combine and coming up with a system that was coherent enough to gracefully accept all of that input. Some ideas just weren't feasible for phase one of a CSS grid. Both concept for inheritance allowed for any arbitrary descent of the grid to lay out as though it were a child element of the grid. That is a feature often referred to as a subgrid, and it didn't make the cut for CSS Grid Layout 1.0. Subgrid has been one of those things that was pointed out immediately, Atanasov said, and that has been a blessing and kind of a hurdle along the way. It was one that held back the spec work for quite a bit, and it was also one that was scaring away some of the implementers. But it's also one of the features that I'm most excited about going forward, and I know that we're going to solve it and it's going to be great. It's just going to take a little while longer. Similarly, there were two options for handling content mapped to grid lines. On one hand, you could let the grid itself have fixed dimension tracks and adjust which ending grid line the overflow content to be mapped to based on how much it's overflowed. Alternatively, you could let the track grow to contain the content so it ended at the predefined grid line. Having both was not an option, as it could create a circular dependency, so the group decided to put the grid snapping idea on hold. Ultimately, many of these edits and puns were made in the light of the CSS working group's three primary goals for the spec. It needed to be powerful. They wanted CSS Grid to enable designers to express their desires in a way that made simple things easy and complex things possible. Robust, they wanted to ensure there would not be gaps that could cause your layout to fall apart and inhibit scrolling or cause content to disappear accidentally. And they wanted it to be performant, so if the algorithm wasn't fast enough to elegantly handle real-world situations like browser resize event and dynamic content loading, they knew it would create a frustrating experience for end users. This is why designing a new layout system for CSS takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of time, a lot of effort, and a lot of love from people who are working on it. Right? Where the rubber meets the road. Before a candidate recommendation, aka the final draft, can become a proposed recommendation that we what the fuck is that word? Colloquially? Fuck it. The W3C needs to see at least 2 independent, interoperable implementations. Microsoft had implemented their draft proposal, but the spec had changed a lot since then. On top of that, they wanted to see other browsers take up on the torch before they committed more engineering effort to update it. Why? Well, they were a little gun shy after what happened with another promising layout proposal, CSS regions. CSS regions offered a way to flow content through a series of predefined regions on a page, enabling really complex layout. Microsoft released an implementation of CSS regions early on behind a prefix in Internet Explorer 10. Apache landed support from regions in WebKit as well. Safari shipped it, as did Chrome, which was still running WebKit under the hood at the time, but then Google backed out of Chrome. Firefox opposed the spec and never implemented it. So the idea is currently in limbo. Even Safari will drop its experimentation support for CSS regions in the next release. Suffice it to say, Microsoft wanted to be sure Grid wouldn't suffer the same fate as regions before committing more engineering resources to it. We had implementers that immediately say, wow, this is great, we should definitely do it, recode Atanasov of Grid, but it's one thing saying, yeah, this is great, we should do it, and there is the next step where there's adding resources and paying developers to go on and actually implement it. There was desire from other implementers. One of the spec editors is from Google, but there was still hesitancy to actually push code. Recalled Microsoft Get Greg Whitworth, a member of the CSS working group, and shipping code is what matters. In an interesting turn of events, the media company Bloomberg hired Igalia, an open source consultancy, to implement CSS Grid for both Blink and WebKit. Back in 2013, we were contacted by Bloomberg because they had very specific needs regarding defining and using grid-like structures. Recalled Sergio Villar-Senin, both a software engineer and a partner in Igalia. They basically asked us to help in the development of the CSS Grid layout specification and also to implement it for Blink and WebKit. Igalia's work helped tremendously because then developers could see it as possibly something that they can actually use when developing their sites. Whitworth added, but even with 2 ready-made implementations, some folks were still concerned the feature wouldn't find its footing. After all, just because a rendering engine is open source doesn't mean its stewards accept every patch, and even if they do, as happened with CSS regions, there is no guarantee the feature will stick around. Thankfully, a good number of designers and developers were starting to get excited about Grid and began to put pressure on browser vendors to implement it. There was a pivotal shift with CSS Grid, with word set, starting with Rachel Andrew coming in and creating a ton of demos and excitement around CSS Grid with Grid by example, and starting to really champion and show it to web developers and what it was capable of and the problems that it solved. Then a little bit later, Jen Simmons, a designer advocate at Mozilla, created something called Labs, where she put a lot of demos that she created for CSS Grid up on the web, and again continued that momentum and the way of enthusiasm for CSS Grid with web developers in the community. Cool. With thought leaders like Andrews and Simmons actively demonstrating the power and versatility of CSS Grid, the web design community grew more excited and began to experiment on sites like CodePen, sharing their ideas and developing their grid layout skills. We'd often think about it, but developer enthusiasm has the power to bolster or bury a spec. We can write a spec, we can go implement things, but if there isn't a developer demand or usage of the features, it doesn't really matter how much we do with that. Unfortunately, with ambitious specs like Grid, the implementation cost can often deter a browser vendor from making the commitment. Without a browser implementation without a browser implementation enabling developers to tinker and experiment, it's hard to build enthusiasm. Without developer enthusiasm, browser vendors are reluctant to spend the money to see the idea gain traction. I'm sure you can see the problem here. In fact, it's particularly what has doomed regions, performance on mobile chipsets, and another cited reason, at least for now. Thankfully, Bloomberg was willingly played the role of a bone factor and got the ball rolling for this new incarnation of CSS Grid. So with its help, Google landed an implementation of CSS Grid in Chromium 56 for Android in January of 2017. It landed its Chrome implementation in early March, just 2 days after Mozilla shipped its own implementation in Firefox. Before the month was over, Opera and Safari had also shipped support for CSS Grid. Ironically, the last company to ship CSS Grid was Microsoft, but it released its implementation in Edge earlier this week. With features on the web platform, you're waiting for a sweet spot. Just prior to, alright, you want a solid spec, you want implementer interest, and you want tons of demand from web developers. Late 2016, early 2017 was a sweet spot. All of that happened. We upgraded our implementation and were stoked to ship it. I don't recall a feature ever shipping like CSS Grid has shipped. Every major browser have shipped it within a matter of a single year, and it will be interoperable because we've been implementing it behind Flux, testing it, making future changes behind Flux, and then it was deemed stable. All of the browsers are now shipping it natively. Alright. With everybody shipping at approximately the same time, Atkins said Grid goes from an interesting idea you can play with to something that you just use as your only layout method without having to worry about fallbacks incredibly quickly. It's been faster than I expected, and any of this to work out. What this means for CSS Grid. Alright, so I think this is the last chapter, and thank God, because my jaw hurts from talking. But anyways, just a bit more. What grid means for CSS. With grid support no longer in question, we can and should begin to make use of this amazing tool. One of the challenges for many of us old-timers who have been working with CSS for the better part of 2 decades is that CSS Grid requires a whole new way of thinking about layout. It's not just attaching your margins and properties to each individual element and placing them. Boss said you can now have a different model, a model where you can start with your layout first and then pull in the different elements into that layout. It is the most powerful layout tool that we have invented yet for CSS. Atkins said it makes page layouts so ridiculously easy. People have always been asking for better layouts just for authorability reasons and because the hacks we were employing weren't as powerful as the old methods of just putting it all in a big old table element. That was popular for a reason. It let you do powerful, complex layouts. It was just the worst thing to maintain and the worst thing for semantics. And Grid gives you back that power and a lot more, which is kind of amazing. CSS Grid takes all of that complicated stuff we have to do to achieve basic layouts and make it completely unnecessary. Etman said you can just talk to a CSS engine directly, you yourself, without an intermediary translator. Okay, CSS Grid offers a lot of power that many of us are only just starting to come to grips with. It will be interesting to see where we go from here. I think it's going to be transformative. Etmat said it's going to take CSS back to what it was meant to be, which is styling and layout language that lifts all of that logic away from the markup and allows for a clean separation of content and style that we've been trying to get from the beginning. I'm excited about the future of CSS layout. With what said, CSS Grid is not the end, it's actually the beginning in Internet Explorer 10. CSS regions as well as CSS exclusions. I think as web designers begin to utilize CSS Grid more and more, they will realize why we shipped all 3 together. And maybe we can continue what we did with CSS Grid and continue to improve upon these specifications, get vendor desire to implement those as well, get the community excited about them and push layout on the web even further. I think that now we have grid exclusions makes absolute sense to have. Andrew said it gives us a way to place something in a grid and wrap text around it, and we don't have any other way to do that. And then things like regions, I would love to see that progress, because once we can build a nice grid structure, we might want to flow content through it. We don't have a way of doing that. As far as I'm concerned, this doesn't stop here. It's just the beginning. But it is the end of my reading, which I'm... Yes, I do feel tired, Supreme Overworld. We're done with this lesson and I'll be ending the stream today. Not because I'm tired of reading, but because I don't have time and it's already late in the night for me, so I have to eat, sleep, go to bed, so on and so forth, so we can have another stream today. But yeah, thank you for listening. If you listened through this whole thing, it was fucking painful, to say the least. Now I just wanted to check the path, and if we see we're already 78% complete with HTML and CSS, and we have just a few more lectures to read, and then we're finally making that admin dashboard, which, by the way, I have seen this one, but I haven't seen student implementation, so maybe we can look at some of them because I'm interested to see what they did. Alright, so this is interesting. I guess it has no functionality, but it's just how you structure the content. This looks a lot nicer. Okay, yeah, I don't think you can click any of those buttons. On the Discord page there's really cool one that's there. I don't have Discord on this Linux. If you can link it, it would be great, so we can show it on stream. But yeah, really cool one, but I don't have access to Discord at the moment. This one, I don't know why they do it like, how do you say it? They do it very literally, and if the image is 3x4 or 4x3, they make it this way. Yeah, I don't know. But these all look good. We're going to make this one with CSS Grid. So you can see the grid in here. So this is a column, and then they have the rows. I'm curious if this one is separate from this one. It kind of looks like it, because as you can see here, it doesn't line up with the center of this, maybe, or I'm not sure. But yeah, okay, admin dashboard. So we're done with this one. Creating grid is the next lesson, but we'll look at it tomorrow. So thank you guys so much for sticking with me through this amazing, also awesome stream that I was reading through the whole time, but we have to pass through these ones as well. So thank you everyone, and I'll be back again tomorrow so we can have more reading, and hopefully we can make some grid layouts. Alright, thank you guys, until next time, see you, bye bye.